Malicious doctor refuses to treat black woman, but 10 minutes later, destiny surprises him with unyielding karma. What happens when a man's arrogance is confronted by a woman's compassion? This is the question that lingers in the air as the story of Dr. Richard Thompson and Angela Davis unfolds in an unforgiving Boston. Richard, a renowned and successful doctor, epitomizes elitism, running an exclusive clinic that exudes wealth but lacks humanity. He considers himself above patients who do not fit his ideal profile, maintaining a cold and haughty attitude towards everyone around him. On the other hand, Angela, a black nurse and single mother, struggles daily against societal prejudices while striving to provide a better life for her children. In the lobby of the clinic, with its modern and impersonal design, Richard rushes in, observing the patients with disdain. His indifference is palpable, and his goal is clear: to avoid treating people who do not meet his standards. Angela, for her part, waits anxiously for her appointment, exhausted after a long shift at a community hospital, where she faces not only physical exhaustion, but also the judgmental stares that surround her. When her name is called, Angela stands up, holding on to her dignity despite her discomfort. In the examination room, the interaction between them is quickly marked by Richard's prejudice. He disdainfully questions her, insinuating that she cannot afford the treatment and suggesting that she seek help at a public hospital. Angela tries to explain herself, but her words are interrupted by Richard, who dismisses her without any remorse. His contempt is sharp, but Angela, with her resilience, maintains her posture as she leaves. However, destiny has an ironic way of acting. After sending Angela away, Richard feels satisfied with his stance until he is confronted by a commotion in the parking lot. A victim of a car accident needs help, and to his surprise, he recognizes the influential politician he has always wanted to impress. But as he attempts to help, an intense pain in his chest brings him down. What should have been an opportunity to shine transforms into a moment of vulnerability, and ironically, Angela, whom he had scorned, is the one who shows up to provide first aid. Without hesitation, Angela acts with professionalism, while Richard finds himself dependent on the woman he humiliated. In the hospital, he watches as she performs her work with dignity and precision. In this moment, Richard's arrogance crumbles, and he reflects on his actions, facing the harsh reality that his prejudice and elitism have led him to a situation where he now needs the compassion of someone he never valued. It is a turning point that reveals the complexities of humanity, where roles are reversed and each person's true nature is exposed. Richard, once so confident in his status, now faces a bitter lesson. The worth of a human being is not measured by money or power, but by the ability to care and act with kindness. This experience will lead him to rethink his beliefs and seek a path of transformation. Thus unfolds a story of overcoming failures and new beginnings, challenging both characters' worldviews and showing that sometimes life has an unexpected way of teaching the most important lessons. Richard Thompson found himself in a place he never imagined. The pain in his chest throbbed intensely, and the hospital lights seemed to dazzle his vision. He felt vulnerable and exposed, a state of being he had always avoided at all costs. The doctor, who prided himself on controlling his life, was now lying on a stretcher, surrounded by nurses and doctors speaking urgently among themselves. Among them, Angela Davis moved with the grace of someone who knew the territory well. As Richard listened to the murmurs around him, reality began to settle in his mind. He remembered how he had treated Angela, his disdain, and now here he was, depending on her. It was a cruel irony, but also an opportunity for learning. Angela, on the other hand, seemed to harbor no resentment. Her expression was one of focus and determination, as if she were more concerned with saving lives than holding on to grievances. This difference between them was an abyss that Richard could barely comprehend. In the days that followed his hospitalization, Richard struggled against fear and weakness. He felt like a fish out of water, surrounded by people he had once considered inferior. He watched Angela in action, interacting with patients, offering words of comfort and care. Each of her gestures made him question his own beliefs. What did it really mean to be a doctor? Was it just a title, or should it involve something deeper? Meanwhile, Angela faced her own challenges. At the community hospital where she worked, she dealt daily with resource shortages and a lack of support. The pressure was intense, and she often felt overwhelmed. She knew that behind every patient was a story of struggle and resilience, and she endeavored to make a difference, even if it meant sacrificing her own rest and well-being. The tension of being a single mother also weighed on her shoulders. She needed to support her children, which made her even more determined to face any obstacle ahead. In a crucial moment, Angela was called to a meeting with the department head, Dr. Mitchell. The director expressed her concern about the number of patients Angela was attending to. "You can't overwork yourself like this, Angela. We need you for the long term, not just today," Dr. Mitchell said, with a look of genuine concern. Angela knew the director was right, but the idea of leaving patients without care troubled her. For her, every life mattered. As Richard recovered, he began to notice the burden that Angela carried. One afternoon, while recuperating in his room, he overheard a conversation between her and one of her colleagues. They were discussing the difficulties of dealing with patients who lacked resources and how many of them were treated as if they were invisible. This stirred something in Richard. He felt guilty not only for his treatment of Angela, but also for his limited view of what it meant to be a healthcare professional. One night, when the pain began to intensify, Richard asked for help, and to his surprise, it was Angela who entered his room. He was about to complain about the pain, but her expression made him hesitate. Angela approached, and with a gentle look, asked how he was feeling. He felt a lump in his throat. It was the first time someone genuinely cared about him. I'm fine," he replied, not believing his own words. Richard realized he needed to set aside his arrogance and accept the help being offered to him. This internal struggle reflected his journey. He knew that to overcome his own fears and prejudices, he would have to open his heart and learn to appreciate the compassion that Angela demonstrated, even after being mistreated. The relationship between the two began to change. Richard started asking questions about her work, the challenges she faced and the stories she carried. Angela, in turn, began to see a different side of him, a man who was starting to shed his armor of arrogance. Although challenges still loomed, there was a new dynamic at play. They were both on a path of discovery, and their future, along with their lives, was about to undergo significant changes. The first obstacles were emerging, and Richard realized that to rise again, he would have to confront not just his fears, but also his beliefs. The life lessons that once seemed distant were now becoming tangible, and Angela's compassion was beginning to illuminate a path he had never considered. What had appeared to be a simple encounter between an arrogant doctor and a dedicated nurse was now transforming into a journey of overcoming and transformation for both. As the days passed, Richard began to feel the pressure of the expectations he had always carried. Recovery was not just physical. He was facing an internal battle, more intense than any surgery he had ever performed. Each time he looked at Angela, he felt a mix of gratitude and shame. He knew he needed to change, but the weight of his former identity as a superior doctor still pulled him back. The idea of being vulnerable terrified him. Angela, for her part, continued to deal with her intense routine. With each shift, she felt more overwhelmed. The community hospital struggled with a lack of resources, and the pressure to care for all patients was only increasing. On a particularly difficult day, a patient she knew well, an elderly man who always greeted her with a smile, passed away. Angela tried to be strong, but tears streamed down her face as she stepped away from the room. She knew this loss was just one of many she faced, but each felt like a scar on her heart. Richard realized that Angela's pain went beyond what he had imagined. Seeing her cry ignited a desire to approach her. He hesitated, thinking of his own insecurities, but decided it was time to act. With effort, he got out of bed and, leaning against the wall, made his way to the nurse's lounge. Angela was there, alone, her hands full of tissues, and her fragility was palpable. "Angela," he called, and she turned, surprised. I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't know you were going through this." The words came out like a whisper, but they were enough to break the barrier between them. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Richard, you don't have to worry about me. I'm just a nurse, and this is part of the job." But he saw the sadness in her eyes, a sadness he now recognized as a reflection of his own struggle. "It's not just that. You are so much more than that. You care and make a difference. I'm learning that now," Richard replied, his voice steady yet vulnerable. For him, it was a step toward change, but life had its own plans. That night, Richard had a setback. The chest pain returned with full force, and he found himself being taken back to the emergency room. Angela was there, and her gaze made him feel a mix of fear and hope. He was in a place he didn't want to be, and the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed him. As the doctors worked frantically around him, the reality of his fragility became clear. He was not invulnerable. He needed help, just like anyone else. When the crisis passed and he was stabilized, Richard found himself reflecting on his life. He had focused so much on his career that he had forgotten what truly mattered: human connection, empathy, and compassion. He wished he could turn back time and do things differently, not just with Angela, but with everyone who crossed his path. Meanwhile, Angela was dealing with her own battle. The pressure of her work and responsibilities at home were beginning to take their toll. One night, she received a call from her babysitter, informing her that her children were sick. Despair flooded her. How could she be present at the hospital and care for her children at the same time? The feeling of sinking in both worlds made her question her ability to manage everything. Richard, still recovering, began to notice Angela's struggles. He decided that he could no longer be just a spectator in his own life or in hers. With a surge of courage, he offered to help her with the children. He knew that this wouldn't solve all the problems, but it was a step to show that he wanted to change, that he cared. Angela looked at him with a mix of gratitude and doubt. She hesitated, responding, "Are you sure? You're still recovering." But the determination in Richard's eyes made her accept. In the following days, while Angela worked, Richard became an unexpected support. He played with the children, helped with homework, and even prepared snacks. Each interaction brought him closer to what it meant to be a true doctor. He was beginning to understand that success was not just about fame or recognition, but about making a difference in the lives of others. The bond between Richard and Angela grew, but challenges still lay ahead. Richard faced his own insecurities, while Angela struggled to balance her responsibilities. External and internal pressures were always present, and much more than good intentions would be needed to overcome the obstacles that would come. Deep down, they both knew they were on a journey of transformation, and that the road ahead would be filled with twists, disappointments, and moments of reflection that would challenge them to become better people. Before we continue with this touching story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. And let us know in the comments which city you are watching this video from. Days went by, and Richard and Angela found themselves increasingly involved in each other's lives. The support he offered to the children brought a new purpose to his recovery, while Angela felt a temporary relief knowing that someone was there to help her. The bond between them, which had once been purely professional, was transforming into something deeper. But, as always, life had its surprises. It was on a particularly sunny day that everything changed. Richard was in Angela's living room, surrounded by scattered toys and children's laughter, when he received a call that would change his world again. It was from the hospital. The voice of the doctor on the other end sounded tense, and the words he heard hit him like a punch in the stomach. "Richard, we need you to come to the hospital immediately. It's about your condition." Richard's heart raced. He knew something was wrong. Angela, noticing his concerned expression, stopped what she was doing and asked, "What happened?" He hesitated, but the urgency of the situation made him respond, "I need to go to the hospital. Something happened with my health." As he made his way to the hospital, Richard's mind was a roller coaster of emotions. Memories of his previous life as a successful doctor flooded his thoughts. He thought about how invulnerable he had felt before, as if nothing could bring him down. Now he was about to face another battle, and the vulnerability that had once terrified him now accompanied him like a shadow. Upon arriving at the hospital, Richard was immediately taken to the emergency room. The familiar environment surrounded him, but everything felt different now. The smell of disinfectant, the whispers of doctors, the bustle of nurses, it all made him feel small and powerless. He was there, not as the doctor he had always been, but as a patient, a man in need of help. When the doctor entered the room, Richard felt a chill in his stomach. The doctor's expression was serious, and the words that followed were hard to hear. "Richard, you've had a complication. We need to act quickly." At that moment, everything he had built in his life flashed before his eyes. His achievements, his career, his image of success, it all felt so fragile. It wasn't the first time he had faced death, but now it was different. He was no longer in control. Angela's presence was a relief, but it also brought a new weight. She was by his side, worried, and Richard could see the anxiety on her face. The pain of knowing she was suffering because of him hit him like a wave. He realized that for too long, he had focused on his own insecurities and flaws, unaware of the impact his struggle had on others. While waiting for the procedure, Richard reflected on his choices. He remembered how he had dismissed vulnerability, as if that weakness had no place in his life. But now, fragility was his new reality. He understood that to truly recover, not just physically, but emotionally. He would need to confront his flaws and accept that he couldn't do everything alone. When he woke up after the procedure, the first thing he saw was Angela, her expression calm but with tired eyes. She had been there, waiting. This simple act of love made Richard realize that success was not just about personal achievements, but also about the bonds we form and the support we give and receive. He had isolated himself in his own bubble of self-sufficiency, but now he understood that true strength lay in accepting help and being vulnerable. From that day on, Richard decided that his recovery would be more than just returning to being a doctor. He wanted to be a whole human being, someone who understood the pain and struggle of others, someone willing to be vulnerable. He realized that life was not about being the best, but about being present and making a difference in the lives of the people around him. Angela, for her part, saw the transformation in Richard. He was no longer the superior doctor she had known, but a man willing to learn and grow. This change inspired her to reconsider her own choices and what truly mattered in her life. What once felt like a burden was now becoming a source of strength and resilience. Over time, they both learned to cope with their weaknesses and find strength in their vulnerabilities. The path ahead was still uncertain, but together they were ready to face the challenges, knowing that true overcoming was not just about winning, but about growing and connecting with those they loved. And so, a new chapter began in their lives where friendship, empathy, and compassion became the pillars of their journey. After the procedure, Richard felt as if he was waking up from a long nightmare. The pain still throbbed in his body, but there was something different in his mind. He looked at Angela, who was by his side, and saw not only concern, but also a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was as if, in that moment, she was holding not just his hand, but also a piece of his new determination. In the following days, Richard faced the challenges of recovery with a new perspective. The hospital, which had once represented his fragility, had now become a symbol of rebirth. He began to understand that although he was physically weakened, there was an inner strength starting to emerge. The physical therapy sessions were painful, and each movement brought a reminder of his former life. However, he remembered the importance of being present, not just for himself, but also for Angela and the children. One morning, while in the therapy room, Richard encountered a new obstacle: frustration. With each attempt to move, he felt as if he was carrying the weight of the world. He looked at the physical therapist, a calm and experienced man, who told him, "Remember, Richard, recovery is not a race. It's a journey. You don't need to be perfect." These words echoed in Richard's mind, and he realized that impatience was only pulling him away from his goal. He began to take deep breaths, to focus on the present moment, and with each small achievement, he felt a bit more confidence. Angela, in turn, was struggling with her own demons. Watching Richard go through this transformation, she began to question her own life and the choices she had made. One quiet afternoon, while having tea on the porch, she opened up to Richard. "You know, I always thought I needed to be strong, that I couldn't show weakness. But now seeing you, I realize that being vulnerable is also a form of strength." Richard smiled, recognizing the struggle she was facing. He had learned to accept help, and now it was her turn to vent. The conversation flowed, and Richard realized that he was not only supporting Angela, but also allowing himself to be supported. Their vulnerability intertwined, creating a stronger bond. He understood that just like him, she also needed someone to share her insecurities and fears. This new dynamic between them began to create a safe space where they could explore their feelings without the weight of judgment. Over time, Richard realized that the true battle was not just physical, but emotional. The memories of his former life as a doctor haunted him. He felt torn between the man he was and the man he was becoming. One day, while walking down the hospital corridor, he encountered a group of doctors discussing a complicated case. He hesitated, feeling the urge to join them, but insecurity held him back. What would he say? How could he contribute? This doubt followed him for days, until he decided that he needed to face this fear. He approached the group and, with a bit of hesitation, introduced himself. To his surprise, the doctors welcomed him warmly. He began to share his ideas and, to his own surprise, discovered that his perspective, even as a patient, was valuable. This interaction not only gave him confidence, but also made him realize that his knowledge still had value, regardless of his condition. However, new challenges arose. The pressure to return to work was mounting, and Richard felt torn. He wanted to help again, but he was also aware that he needed time to fully recover. Every time his phone rang, his heart raced. It was a call from colleagues asking for advice or updates on cases. He struggled between the desire to help and the need to take care of himself. One night, while looking out the window, Richard found himself reflecting on what truly mattered. He didn't want to be just the doctor who saved lives, but rather a man who understood the fragility of life. He wanted to be an example for the children, showing them that it's okay to ask for help and that struggles are part of the journey. With this in mind, he decided that instead of rushing back to work, he would dedicate this time to fully rebuild himself, both physically and emotionally. Angela, sensing the intensity of his internal struggles, became his confidant. She encouraged him to write about his experiences, suggesting that it could help him process everything he was going through. Richard began to write a journal, putting into words his fears, achievements, and reflections. This simple act became a form of therapy for him, allowing him to organize his thoughts and connect even more with himself. As the days turned into weeks, Richard and Angela learned to navigate together through the uncertainties of life. Each small step was a victory, each conversation an opportunity for growth. They were building not just a new future, but a new way of seeing life, where vulnerability and connection became the pillars of their journey. Richard watched the sun rise through the hospital window, a spectacle of light that seemed to symbolize his own transformation. The pain in his body was still palpable, but as the days passed, he realized that the deeper scars were inside his mind. He struggled with the feeling of loss, the loss of his identity as a doctor, the loss of control over his life. Yet at the same time, he began to glimpse a new possibility that had previously seemed distant. Recovery was not just a physical matter, it was an emotional battle. Richard became more aware that to overcome his challenges, he needed to trust himself and also accept help from others. In physical therapy sessions, he remembered the words of the therapist, "Recovery is not a race." Over time, he began to apply this philosophy to his life. He allowed himself to feel frustration, but also joy in the small victories. Each step he took was a reminder that he was rising again. Angela, his partner, was also on a journey of self-discovery. Through deep conversations, she began to open her heart and share her own insecurities. Richard saw how her vulnerability was a form of strength. They learned to support each other, creating a safe space where they could express feelings without fear of judgment. This new dynamic not only strengthened their relationship, but also helped Richard understand that vulnerability was an essential aspect of being human. In that process, he began to rebuild his life with a new perspective. Instead of seeing himself merely as a doctor, Richard started to realize that his worth went beyond his profession. He was a father, a friend, and a human being. The calls from his colleagues, which once made him anxious, now represented an opportunity to connect and share his experience. He began to see that even as a patient, his voice still carried weight, and that his experiences could help others. But this journey was not without obstacles. Richard faced at every moment the dilemma of returning to work. The pressure mounted, and he questioned whether he was ready. One night of introspection, while looking at the stars outside, he realized that success was not just about being back in the hospital, but about feeling whole and healthy, both physically and emotionally. He wanted to be an example for his children, showing them that true strength comes from vulnerability and that it is okay to ask for help. With this new understanding, Richard decided he needed to take a step back and focus on his complete recovery. He allowed himself to feel every emotion, every pain, and every joy. The journal he started writing became a powerful tool. In it, he not only documented his struggles, but also his victories. Gradually, he began to see patterns in his life and understand that each challenge was an opportunity for growth. Weeks turned into months, and Richard saw the transformation within himself. He was no longer the man who viewed himself solely through the lens of his profession. He had become a man who understood the complexities of life, who knew that each day brought new lessons. He learned the importance of connecting with others and accepted that true strength comes from acknowledging weaknesses. His friendship with his physician colleagues evolved. They began to see him not just as a former colleague, but as someone who had much to offer. This new dynamic helped Richard feel part of a group again, even in a different role. He became a mentor, sharing his experiences and inspiring others to see beyond pain and fear. By the end of his recovery, Richard found himself in a place of peace. He had learned that life was not a straight line of successes, but a journey filled with ups and downs. The lessons he learned along the way were not just about overcoming challenges, but about the importance of human connection, vulnerability, and accepting help. He realized that true success was not measured in material possessions, but in the wealth of experiences and relationships he cultivated. Richard's transformation was evident, and he was ready to face the world again, not as the doctor he once was, but as the man he had become. Richard was at a critical point in his journey. After months of recovery, he felt stronger, both physically and emotionally. However, the pressure to return to work as a doctor increased with each passing day. He knew he could not avoid this decision for much longer. That morning, as the sun shone through the hospital window, he found himself thinking about everything he had faced and learned. But the weight of doubt still haunted him. It was the day of his interview with the hospital board. Richard had been invited to discuss his return, but the thought of sitting at the table with those who were once his colleagues made him nervous. What would happen if he wasn't ready? What if, upon returning, everything he had worked to achieve crumbled in an instant? These questions haunted him, creating a storm of insecurities within. The moment he stepped into the room, a wave of memories hit him. He remembered how many times he had been in that space, confident, ready to make decisions that impacted lives. Now, however, he felt vulnerable, like a fish out of water. The board was gathered, and the expressions of his colleagues ranged from concern to expectation. Richard took a deep breath, recalling the lessons he had learned about vulnerability and connection. He needed to be honest. He began, with a slightly trembling voice, that he was there today because he needed to share how this experience had transformed him. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a man who had learned that true strength lies in recognizing fragility and in seeking help. He saw some heads nodding, but also noticed looks of doubt. The tension in the room was palpable. The director, a man whom Richard respected deeply, asked a straightforward question. "Do you feel ready to return to work, Richard?" The question hit him like a blow. He thought of all the hours dedicated to physical therapy, the emotional conversations with Angela, and the moments of introspection under the stars. He reflected on his new outlook on life, where success wasn't a straight line but a journey filled with ups and downs. "I'm not sure I'm ready to return exactly as I was before," Richard replied honestly. "But I'm ready to face new challenges and learn from them. I want to use my experience to help others, not just as a doctor, but as someone who understands pain and struggle. I want to be a mentor, an example that recovery is possible and that vulnerability is not weakness but a form of strength." Silence followed. Richard looked around, seeing expressions of surprise. Then, someone started to applaud. It was a colleague, and soon others joined in. Richard felt a wave of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a bit of fear. He realized that, regardless of what happened next, he was surrounded by people who supported him. The board deliberated, and after moments that felt like an eternity, the director finally spoke. "Richard, we admire your spirit. What you've proposed is something new for us. We would like to offer you an opportunity to return, but with a different focus. We want you to participate in the support program for recovering physicians. Your experience can be extremely valuable." Richard felt a wave of emotion. This was his chance to apply everything he had learned. He was not returning as the perfect doctor, but as someone who had faced his weaknesses and emerged stronger. This new role would allow him to help others find their way, just as he had found his. He accepted the offer, feeling a sense of peace flood his heart. After the meeting, Richard left the room with a smile. He realized that he no longer needed to define himself solely by his profession. The true wealth lay in the connections he had cultivated, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had discovered within himself. That night, looking at the stars, he felt that his journey was just beginning. He had overcome his challenges, not because he had become a doctor again, but because he had become a complete human being, capable of giving and receiving support. And there, under the illuminated sky, Richard understood that life was a dance between pain and joy, and that each step, no matter how difficult, brought him closer to becoming the best version of himself. After the meeting, Richard felt the weight of uncertainties lift. He had accepted a new role at the hospital, a role that would not only allow him to return to the environment he loved, but would also place him in a position of support and understanding. As he walked through the hallways, now more familiar than ever, he realized that each step carried new meaning. His colleagues began to approach him, offering words of encouragement and support. One of them, Clara, who had always been a close friend, said, "I'm so happy for you, Richard. You're going to make a difference. Your experience is valuable." He smiled, feeling grateful to have people like Clara by his side. The days that followed were a mix of challenges and rewards. Richard began working with doctors and nurses who were struggling with their own battles. He listened to them, shared his experiences, and offered advice that came not only from his medical training, but from his personal journey. The connection he felt with those he helped filled him with renewed purpose. Every story he heard reminded him that struggle was a natural part of life. In one of the support sessions, he met Marcos, a young resident who had faced the loss of a patient. Marcos was distressed, feeling guilty and unable to move forward. Richard remembered his own pain when he lost a patient and how he had struggled to forgive himself. He approached Marcos and said, "Pain is part of being a doctor. We can't save everyone, but we can learn from each experience. The important thing is not to lose yourself along the way and to know that you are not alone." These words seemed to resonate with Marcos, who began to open up slowly. Richard saw a glimmer of hope in the young man's eyes, and it moved him. He realized that by helping others, he was also healing himself. The weeks turned into months, and Richard began to notice changes in his life. He felt more confident, more connected with his colleagues, and more importantly, more at peace with himself. The pressure that had once consumed him was now a source of motivation. He was willing to face the challenges that arose, not just as a doctor, but as a human being who understood the fragility of life. One night, on his way home, Richard reflected on his journey. He remembered the time he spent in rehabilitation, the lonely nights and the tears he shed. Now he had a new understanding. Vulnerability was not a sign of weakness, but a bridge to empathy and connection. He smiled as he realized that his story could help others find strength in their own struggles. The next day, when he met with Angela, his friend and confidant, Richard shared his reflections. "You know, Angela, I really feel like I'm living a new life. Helping others has brought me a peace I never expected to find. It's like I've discovered a greater purpose." Angela smiled, proud of him. "You've always had that light inside you, Richard. Now you're sharing it with the world." As time passed, Richard became a pillar within the hospital, not only for the doctors but also for the patients facing their own battles. He began organizing support groups where people could share their experiences without fear of judgment. The meetings became a safe space where vulnerability was embraced and transformed into strength. Richard realized that his role had expanded. He was not just a doctor, but a mentor, a friend, and a guide. With each story shared, he felt his own burdens lighten. He was helping to create an environment where healing was not just physical, but also emotional. In every smile, in every thank you, Richard found confirmation that his choices had been right. He had rediscovered himself, and in doing so he helped others find their way back to themselves. Life, with all its complexities, now seemed clearer. Richard knew that the journey would never end, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Richard had come a long way since he decided to return to the hospital. His journey of overcoming not only transformed him, but also profoundly impacted those around him. Over the months, he became a symbol of hope and resilience. With each support group he organized, with each patient he helped, Richard felt that his experiences of pain and healing intertwined, creating a network of solidarity and empathy. Over time, he realized that his actions were not just an act of giving back, but a form of revenge against the pain he had felt. The pain that had nearly broken him was now becoming fuel for his mission. He was no longer willing to be a victim of his circumstances. Instead, he became an agent of change. Richard was determined to ensure that no one else went through what he had without support, understanding, and love. On a sunny morning, as Richard walked through the hospital corridors, he came across a sign announcing the launch of a new mental health program, an idea he had proposed months earlier. His heart raced as he realized that his vision was coming to fruition. He remembered the tough moments, the days he doubted whether he could return to being who he was. Now, all of that seemed so distant. He had risen again, and in doing so, helped others to rise as well. That same day, while talking with Marcos, now a more confident and secure resident, Richard felt a wave of gratitude. He had not only helped heal Marcos, but had also healed himself in the process. The friendship between them flourished, and together they became an example of how vulnerability can create strong and meaningful bonds. Richard smiled as he realized he was no longer alone. He had built a supportive community, a true home in the hospital. At the end of each week, Richard sat down to reflect on his achievements and the lessons learned. He understood that success was not measured solely by professional accomplishments, but by the ability to touch lives and make a difference. He remembered his conversations with Angela, which always encouraged him to look beyond himself. Richard knew that his new purpose was the true meaning of wealth. As time passed, Richard became a mentor not only to doctors and residents, but also to patients and their families. He shared his experiences, not as a model of perfection, but as someone who had struggled and triumphed over difficulties. He inspired others to do the same, to embrace vulnerability and find strength in weaknesses. Richard's story did not end there. He had learned that life was made up of new beginnings and that each one brought with it the opportunity to grow and transform. He invited everyone around him to reflect on their own journeys, to come together, and to share their experiences, creating a chain of support and love. And so, Richard, now a true agent of change, looked to the future with hope. He did not forget the lessons of the past, but used them as a guide to illuminate the path ahead. Revenge against pain was no longer something bitter. It was an act of love and compassion. If you have also faced challenges and found the strength to rise again, share your experiences in the comments. Let's create a space of support and inspiration together. Click like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing stories that touch the heart and help transform lives. Your story could be the light someone needs. The time is now.